And we now turn to San Francisco. Marvin, if you could join us and give us a little bit of insight from the other side of the world. So Marvin is a partner at Diaspora Ventures, and he is involved in so many different things at a global level. And we love to hear from him on the ecosystem building, investment state as it exists. There's a lot of LinkedIn talk. Hi, Marvin. Thank
Hey,
you
man.
that you could. We got in 8-9 minutes, like
I'll get us
time.
back on track. I'll do this in like 5
What
minutes.
time is it on your side right now?
It's 12:40. So it's 12:40. So it's I do this
past
all the
midnight.
time. I don't like to do it. I do this all the time though. So it's okay. And thank you for having me. So let me share and hopefully this works. Do you see my presentation?
It's coming on. Let's see.
You are sharing screen. I see it on my screen. I don't know if you see it on yours.
Yes, it is. It is
Okay.
visible. Yeah.
Yeah, so maybe I'll do a quick intro. So I call myself the Forrest Gump of Silicon Valley. So I've done a bunch of different things in Silicon Valley. I've been in San Francisco now 22 years, originally from Canada, grew up in an immigrant family, moved to the US to make my fortune. And so started off doing startups. So I was very, very early at a startup that raised about $45 million before it completely imploded. You know, I joined Yahoo, back in 2001. And so I actually ran a bunch of business units there and did that for about 10 and a half years, doing international expansion. Then I became a VC after that. So I actually started the SF office for 500 startups. And so I ran the core Accelerator program and helped invest. I was one of the main partners investing out of Fund 3 and Fund 4. So between the Accelerator and the funds, I invested in the 6 years I was there, I invested in over 414 pre-seed and seed stage startups. I left end of 2019, beginning of 2020, and basically I do my own thing right now. So I run a gaming holding company that's based, between sort of like Germany, Ukraine, and LA. And I also run a small seed fund, pre-seed fund called Diaspora, which is sort of, I think, where I'm speaking from here. And so I'll talk a little about the Diaspora afterwards. And I also do small angel investments, very opportunistic angel investments as well too. So my investment count is about 450 investments I've done now. And, I would say about 35 to 40% of my investments are companies outside the US market. And so it's a pretty big sample set. And so that sort of gives you context, and hopefully hopefully gives me, hopefully I can speak with some credibility about stuff, right? This is established credibility slide. So this is about me. Diaspora. So I run Diaspora with my good friend Carlos Diaz, who's also an entrepreneur. He's a French entrepreneur. So he runs a company, a very successful entrepreneur. He runs, we run this VC fund, but we also have he's an operator. So he runs a Silicon Valley VC funded startup in the Web3 space. And so, Carlos and I knew each other from before. And, our thesis basically is that, the whole world is globalizing, right? So I think you've heard this many, many times. There's so many interesting markets, but, whatever market you're coming from, the US market is just hard, right? And I can say this as a Canadian moving to the US, I love the Americans. Are savages when it comes to business and sales and marketing. And so it's just a different market. It's 330 million people, like one massive market. Americans are just so good at presenting. They're so good at they're just different rules, and the pace, and hyper competitive. Not to say that isn't the case in a lot of other places, but just there's some rules you have to learn when you come here, just like Carlos had to learn when he moved here like 12 years ago, just like I had to learned when I moved here 22 years ago. And so we're basically operators who basically invest. And so we love working with early stage founders, particularly from Europe, to sort of come over here who have the ambition and interest to move over to the US market and start businesses in the US. That's our thesis. And so that's what we do. We invest in European founders coming to the US market at the pre-seed stage. So we invest painfully early. And so now we have about 31 companies we've invested in. So we're a rolling fund model. We do about 3 to 4 deals, typically a quarter. And they're all European founders, all European founders who come over here. And so, the reason why we love the market, right? Europe is just incredible design talent, incredible technology talent, cost structure. You can build these like global companies where, you basically build out your, I'm going to go to the next slide, like it's cross-border, right? And so, what's happening now is you're seeing these multi-country startups, right? You build your sales and marketing in the US, if you're targeting the US market, but you basically keep your tech and back office, back home, wherever country it is. And that just makes a lot of sense. And, I've had a lot of success with this strategy. So some of the best performing companies in my portfolio, like ManyChat, Printify, Aircall is another one. Like French, started off in France, for example, and now like they're worth multiple billions of dollars of valuation, right? And I can talk a little bit more about them later on, of like, founders from Europe coming over to the US market and dominating the US market. And, this is becoming more and more common. This wasn't common when I first started investing back in the early 2010s. It's way more common now. You look at almost every single major company, they have like their companies are basically split between like different regions. And so that's the opportunity. And they're not just usually based in one country. And, the other thing I'll say just about the startup scene is like, yes, it is very challenging for fundraising and stuff this year, but there's a lot of dry powder just in the US alone. There's like $290 billion of dry powder. There's a lot of VC funds who've raised a lot of money in the last couple of years. They will need to deploy, even though they're deploying things very, very slowly right now. They're, or even not at all, because they're sort of taking a break and from the shock of just sort of like all the implosions of a lot of companies in the stock market and whatnot. But, I'm very, very bullish. This money will be spent eventually. So maybe not this year, maybe next year, maybe the year after, this money will be spent. So even though it looks really, really tough right now, things are taking a little bit longer. In general, I'm quite bullish overall. And I'm ultimately very, very bullish on the Nordic region for several reasons. For a lot of things I've seen in Silicon Valley, where like there's the PayPal mafia, there's the Yahoo mafia, like there's the Airbnb mafia now, right? Like there's a eBay mafia, like that's actually a real thing. And so I see this of just what you see in emerging sort of like, fast growing ecosystems, champion companies, right? So for example, iZettle was a good exit. Klarna is doing, well, still doing well. They took a big devaluation, but still a great company, right? Zendesk, Trade Doubler back in the day. Like there's so many ex-Trade Doubler people running significant companies here. And so these academy companies really, really matter. Spotify as well too. Academy companies matter because people who've seen it done going through scaling, like a lot of times you're gonna see people spin out and actually do their own thing. And so you're gonna, there's a lot of critical mass in the Nordic region. There's even way more successful companies that I just haven't listed, right? I don't have enough sort of like space here. And so that's why I'm very, very bullish on the region. Where you see a lot of, where you see massive exits, or you see like significant companies sort of like grow out of the ecosystem, inevitably you usually see a lot of spin outs and a lot more startup activity. And so that's why I'm bullish on the Nordic region in general. Yes, it's 20. I expect 2022 to be fairly tough, and I think 2023 is going to be pretty tough. But in general, I'm super optimistic. I'm super optimistic about the tech industry. I'm super optimistic about startups. I'm super optimistic about just sort of all these ecosystems growing in the long run, right? Like, and so I'm in the VC business. We're investing, on a 10 to 12 year timeline. So in the 10 to 12 year timeline, like this is just going to be a blip, even though I'm not putting aside the hardship and the challenges that are going to come about, that are happening now, that will come about. Like long term, I'm really, really bullish in general. And I talked with Nomo, I'm just going to wrap up, the idea is just like, look, you just have to survive, right? And so you got to be this term, this gorilla. It's not a term I made up. And so if you're going to name a startup, like, like a growing sort of champion startup, like I hate the term unicorn, like $1 billion valuation. That's garbage. You can have $1 billion valuation, but have no revenue, right? And so this idea of a gorilla is like, and this is actually Aircall, like they publicly said this, they're worth several $1 billion in valuation. They did $100 million in revenue last year, right? That's what you want. And so don't be a unicorn, be a gorilla. Like that's what you should be targeting.
Awesome. Marvin, I love the energy in your presentation. You talked about the US market. What a clear description. I love the way you talked about the market being hyper competitive. Of course, that's the difference. And sometimes I coach like between 500 to 1,000 early stage founders every year. And I sometimes feel that in Nordics, we are not presenting ourselves that up. So great ideas.
You're too humble. You're too humble.
Exactly.
Yeah,
So that's a great.
you don't get points with for humility in the US. It isn't. And I say this as an American now and as a Canadian, like it was a culture shock to me. I'm like, oh, US same culture. You go there and like, no, it's not. It is not the same culture. They are savages when it comes to business. They are savages when it like win at all costs. Like it's just a different culture.
Awesome, awesome. I love that insight. I also loved your optimism. And I think that resonates with what Magnus also started with. So I love that. And finally, the slide that you had on don't be a unicorn, be a gorilla. So I think that's a lot of insight coming in on even on social networks for all the amazing founders who have joined in today. How do you want to build your venture? Is it something meaningful? Is it something disciplined? Because discipline somewhere got lost in late stage startups. That's my reading. But anyway, thank you so much, Marvin, for joining us today. We